Hi everyone, I'm Yasmin, and here I will present a recently published paper published in Environmental Sociology that I co-wrote with Mark Stoddart and David Tyndall. And here on the screen, you can see details about how to find this article online. In this study, we focus on public discourse surrounding the United Nations 2021 Climate Change Conference, also known as COP26. And COP26 was a big one for animals. On day one of the conference, Guinea's climate envoy asked for a minute of silence for all the species that we've lost. On day two, Indigenous activist Chai Surui warned that the climate is warming, the animals are disappearing, the earth is speaking. The COP26 menu also drew a lot of attention, and many environmental groups criticized it for being mostly animal-based, saying that this didn't reflect the climate emergency that we're in. And this is consistent with the climate research, for example, this article, which shows that even if we stopped all fossil fuel emissions today, that current trends in our global food system would prevent us from achieving the 1.5-degree warming target and would even endanger the 2-degree target. We can also see in the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land how various diets compare in terms of their greenhouse gas mitigation potential. And we can see at the very top that diets without any animal source foods have by far the greatest greenhouse gas mitigation potential. And outside on the streets, animals and animal issues were very prominent. So this all inspired our research question, which asks, how are animals portrayed in climate change discourse? So, animals and climate change discourse. First up, I'll say that we present a typology of 4 ways in which animals were framed as metaphors or symbols for climate-related concerns, citizens with interests worth respecting, biodiversity or key ecosystem components, or resources for human use. First up, animals as metaphors framing. So Kalof's book, Looking at Animals in Human History, is really useful for thinking about how animals are portrayed in images and in text. And she deploys the notion of looking at animals. And this involves careful attention to things like illustration, personification, description. The concept of social movement frames is also helpful, and this refers to the signifying activity or meaning construction that movement leaders perform to inspire collective action. And this is also useful because it orients our attention to how different actors are portraying animals for various eco-political purposes. Also useful is Sapir's work on symbolism. And Sapir distinguishes straightforward referential symbols from condensation symbols that extend to things apparently far removed from the original meaning of the symbol. So this helps clarify whether animals are being used as self-referential symbols, like the image of a bird being used to reflect the bird or his or her species, or if animals are being used as metaphors, as symbols for human-related concerns that aren't directly related to animals. And of course, polar bear imagery is a really common way of representing climate change and climate change harms. And this is because it helps make abstract and technically complex issues like accumulating greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, it helps make these things more concrete and comprehensible. Next is animals as citizens framing. So Donaldson and Kimlicka's book Zoopolis offers a guide for thinking about animals as society members. And here they present a political theory of animal rights outlining humans' various obligations to domesticated animals, wilderness animals, and liminal animals that are wild but live in human settings. So different types of obligations based on the various kinds of relationships that different animals have to human society. Also central within the animals to citizens framing is indigenous perspectives on animal personhood. So contrary to dominant colonial understandings of animals as inferior and as property, many indigenous legal orders and worldviews regard animals as persons or kin. So for example, Brighton explains how animal personhood refers to the idea that animals are active individuals capable of intentional social interaction, such as reciprocal exchange. And within Mi'kmaq perspectives, Robinson notes that it frames animals as self-aware, rational beings. So given such attention to this interspecies justice, Deca notes that reconciliation and decolonization within institutions means they must shift towards earth nature respecting values that inhabit indigenous legal traditions. And within the legal context, this should mean ending animals' legal status as property. And one visual technique for representing animals as citizens is animal portraiture. And this highlights animal personality and evokes emotion from the viewer. Other approaches include documenting animal exploitation from a critical perspective, as well as documenting positive human-on-human interactions like animal rescue. Next, animals as biodiversity framing. So Atfield's overview of environmental ethics distinguishes between various theories of value, including anthropocentrism, the idea that only human interests matter, sentientism, the idea that all sentient beings matter, biocentrism, the idea that all life has value, and ecocentrism, the idea that ecosystems have value beyond what they provide for living creatures. And it's important to distinguish ecocentric and biocentric concerns about biodiversity from anthropocentric views that focus on how humans can benefit from biodiversity via things like ecosystem services or natural resources. Because conceiving biodiversity in these human-centered utilitarian terms does not guarantee protection of species that aren't directly useful to humans. And of course, one common way of portraying animals as biodiversity is traditional wildlife photography, which is concerned with producing a sense of nature. Finally, animals as resources framing. In Livestock Deadstock, Wilkie shows how workers from various small to large-scale operations portray farmed animals as commodities. So in large-scale operations, animals might simply be seen as means to make money, whereas in smaller-scale operations, animals can be seen as temporary pet livestock, but of course, they're still considered property and still sent to slaughter. And for wild animals as well, Keel shows how they're commonly framed as material resources or commodities. For example, she shows how early conservationist sport hunters established a utilitarian ethos towards wild animals and how they used economic language to frame them as natural resources, describing them as crops to be harvested and as wild beasts that are by right property of humans. And in terms of their visual representation, images that naturalize animals' instrumental status as property, stock, or wild stock would be candidates for the animals as resources framing. And here's a review of the 4 framings: animals as metaphors, citizens, biodiversity, and resources. A bit about our methods. So we conduct a qualitative analysis of Instagram posts. Our sample includes over 2,000 posts that featured the COP26 hashtag, and these posts were collected during the COP26 meetings as well as before and after. And we collected these posts with NCapture and imported them into NVivo for coding. And we started with coding meta-categories on discourse, imagery, and organizations or collective actors, and subcodes were added inductively. And once we coded the Instagram posts, we exported our coding matrices from NVivo and conducted a discourse network analysis in Visone. So a bit about discourse network analysis. So discourse network analysis is a network analysis-based approach to analyzing texts. And this involves a qualitative analysis of public discourse with special attention to how various social actors and/or semantic units relate within the same discursive context. And this is really cool because it allows researchers to articulate relationships between different types of components into things like actor-concept networks, actor-actor networks, and concept-concept networks. And again, here we focus on how the 4 animal framings connect to images of animals, climate discourses, and organizations or collective actors. So onto the discourse networks. Here's our first discourse network. We can see represented by the blue square nodes, the 4 animal framings, and the circle nodes represent all the animals that appeared within the Instagram posts. So near the bottom, we can see, for example, that birds were really prominent and were often portrayed as metaphors, citizens, and biodiversity. And near the top left, we can see the cows were also prominent and were also portrayed as metaphors, but also as resources and as citizens. Here's our second discourse network. This shows how the various animal framings connected to different types of climate discourses. And one thing I'll draw your attention to is how the animals as resources framing near the top is really peripheral in this network, whereas the animals as biodiversity, metaphor, and citizens framings are connected near the bottom to a larger number and greater diversity of discourses. So, for example, near the right, we can see greening capitalism, but also near the bottom left, anti-capitalist framing. Here's our next discourse network. This shows how the four framings connect to different organizations or collective actors by actor category. So, for example, near the bottom in the dark green node representing NGOs and social movement actors, we can see that these types of actors were often framing animals as metaphors, citizens, and biodiversity. And here's our last discourse network. This shows how all the individual actors, all the individual organizations or collective actors framed animals in their posts. So a little bit of our findings. So first up, we can see that humans are framing animals in multiple ways at once for various eco-political purposes, including promoting climate action, biodiversity protection, animal liberation, and greenwashing or technological fixes. And how animals are being portrayed in climate communication is important because it guides political and public perceptions about the ecological crisis, and it informs possibilities for corrective action. And these include industry-motivated adjustments to farmed animals' bodies or immediate environments, or nature-motivated changes to political, economic, and legal institutions. We can also see here that there are competing narratives of farmed animals as citizens versus resources, and this suggests a potential cultural shift towards more indigenous or animal rights perspectives. And if farmed animals as citizens framing were adopted in our broader culture and political institutions, this could help accelerate climate change mitigation by helping in the transition towards more plant-based food systems. Of course, this shift confronts significant resistance from animal agriculture industries, which engage in similar greenwashing and obstructionist tactics as the fossil fuel industries, including underreporting emissions, promoting technological fixes, funding climate change counter movements, and extensive lobbying against climate policy. We also see that engaging a diversity of perspectives on animals enhanced climate discourse, and it did this by generating a broader range of arguments and solutions. And this is especially true for posts that eschewed the dominant animals as resources framing. And this is significant because we know that the availability of diverse theories and perspectives and willingness to engage with them is essential to successful decision-making. And finally, the prominence of the animals as citizens and animals as biodiversity framings suggests that many actors are supportive of including animals' own interests in decisions about climate change adaptation and mitigation. Thank you.